Imagine walking through the frozen, muddy streets of 13th century Paris or Oxford. You are 14 years old, miles away from your village, and your stomach hasn't known a full meal in days. You wear a tattered wool cloak, and your only possession is a single, hand-copied Latin grammar, a book that cost more than your father's farm. To the wealthy sons of nobles, you are a shadow in the halls. To the local baker, you are just another beggar singing for a crust of bread. This was the brutal reality of the medieval poor student. In a world of rigid social castes, education was the ultimate gamble, a path of starvation, bone-chilling cold, and violence, all for a desperate shot at a better life. Today, we peel back the stone walls of the great universities to reveal the hidden, gritty survival story of those who risked everything for the light of knowledge. This is how the poor student survived the Middle Ages. For a poor child in the 11th century, the doors to the world of the mind were almost always made of heavy, monastic oak. In a landscape dominated by feudal labour, the only golden ticket out of the fields was often found within the walls of Benedictine monasteries. This was the system of the oblates, young boys, often from humble or even destitute families, who were offered to the church. Parents, driven by a mix of religious devotion and the desperate hope that their sons would not starve, handed their children over to the monks. In exchange for manual labour and a lifetime of service, these boys received something more valuable than gold: literacy. Inside the monastery, the life of a poor student was a clockwork of austerity. They woke before the first light of dawn for religious offices, their breath visible in the unheated stone chapels. Their curriculum was the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, but their reality was sweat and ink. They spent hours bent over desks, learning the precise art of manuscript copying. Their fingers stained with soot-based ink as they preserved the very text they were learning to read. Their diet was a monotonous cycle of bread, vegetable pottage, and beer, which was safer to drink than the local water. However, as the 12th century dawned, the map of education began to shift from the silent countryside to the growing, chaotic cities. This was the era of the cathedral schools. Unlike the secluded monasteries, these schools were built in the heart of urban centres, near the great churches. For the sons of poor artisans and struggling merchants, this was a revolution. These schools were more accessible, focusing on preparing students for careers in the growing bureaucracies of the church and state. But even in the city, the golden ticket wasn't free. While the church had a fundamental principle of charity, providing food and shelter to the poor and pilgrims, the competition for a spot was fierce. Poor students often had to live in cramped, shared lodgings funded by private donors or local parishes. They survived by working as scribes, choir boys, or even low-level assistants to clergymen. It was a meritocracy of hunger. To stay in the cathedral school, a poor student had to prove they were more brilliant than their wealthy counterparts, relying on the recommendations of masters who held their entire future in their hands. The transition had begun. Education was moving out of the cloister and into the market square, setting the stage for the birth of the university. Quick pause in the story. Tell us, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in comments below. Subscribe now, point your phone camera at the QR code on screen. Join the crazy medieval history. By the 13th century, the rise of the first universities in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford transformed education from a monastic duty into a high-stakes investment. For a poor student, entering these hallowed halls wasn't just a matter of intellect. It was a desperate battle against a crushing economic system. Unlike the old monasteries where room and board were part of the life of an oblate, the new universities operated on a system of direct payment. The economic war began at the gates. First, there were the enrollment fees, matriculation taxes that varied by faculty but were often insurmountable for a peasant's son. Then came the cost of living in a university city. Students had to find housing in crowded urban markets, usually in shared hostels or bursa where rent was sky-high due to the sudden influx of scholars. Even the very clothes on their backs were regulated. Academic gowns were required, and while authorities tried to prevent flashy displays of wealth, the simple act of owning a decent wool robe was a luxury for many. But the true gold of the medieval world was the book. Before the printing press, every single textbook was a manuscript copied manually by a scribe. These books were astronomically expensive, often costing as much as a small plot of land. A poor student couldn't dream of owning a personal library. They had to rely on renting sections of books from stationers or spending hours in libraries, chained to the desks, desperately memorizing texts they could never afford to take home. Recognizing that the church was losing some of its brightest minds to poverty, a new system of support began to emerge: the founding colleges. These were established by wealthy donors Nobles, bishops, and canons specifically to house and fund talented but destitute scholars. The most famous example was the Collège de la Sorbonne in Paris, founded in 1257. It provided housing, food, and small stipends to theology students of high academic quality who lacked the means to pay. However, life inside these colleges was far from luxurious. They were modelled after monasteries, demanding a life of austerity. Students were forbidden from wearing jewellery or fine clothes and were forced to eat a simple, repetitive diet of bread, beer, and pottage. Most importantly, the number of these scholarships was tiny compared to the demand. In universities like Vienna, records show that while nearly 43% of students were classified as poor, only a small fraction ever secured a spot in a founding college. For the rest, the struggle for a degree was a daily exercise in survival. For the thousands of poor students who could not secure a spot in a founding college like the Sorbonne, the search for a roof was a descent into the urban underworld. University cities like Paris, Oxford, and Cambridge were notoriously overcrowded, and landlords were rarely merciful. While university regulations occasionally stepped in to set maximum rents, the poorest scholars were often forced into the margins, living in damp cellars or drafty attics shared with multiple families or fellow students. The typical dormitory for a destitute student was a nightmare of shared misery. It was common to find 4 to 8 scholars crammed into a single, unventilated room. There was no heating. In the bitter winters of Northern Europe, the cold was a constant, gnawing enemy. Without proper sanitation, these lodgings became breeding grounds for respiratory diseases. Often, there was no furniture at all, just a single straw mattress shared between 2 or 3 students. A practice so common that some scholars even had to take turns sleeping while their roommates used the only decent pair of shoes they owned to attend a lecture. This wasn't just uncomfortable, it was biologically devastating. Modern bioarchaeology has provided a grim window into the physical toll of this lifestyle. Recent examinations of the remains of poor apprentices and students from the late medieval period reveal a shocking pattern of hardship. These skeletons show clear evidence of hussars' lines and other pathological lesions, indicating severe adversity and malnutrition during their early lives. Many of these young men suffered from significant growth delays. A poor student in the 14th century was likely several inches shorter than his noble peers. His body literally stunted by a lack of protein and vitamins. The mortality rate was staggering. High incidences of chronic respiratory infections and evidence of repeated physiological stress suggest that, for many, the pursuit of a degree was a race against a premature grave. The environment was a sensory assault, the smell of unwashed bodies, the dampness of the stone walls, and the constant fear of the next plague outbreak. In these shadows, the light of knowledge felt very far away. Yet, thousands persisted, huddled together for warmth in the dark, clutching their Latin primers and hoping that their minds could carry them out of the squalor that was slowly claiming their health. In the medieval university, the Hunger Games was not a metaphor, it was a literal, daily struggle for caloric survival. While the wealthy sons of the nobility enjoyed multi-course banquets of game, spiced wine, and fine white bread, the poor student's stomach was a landscape of constant, gnawing void. Their entire existence was fueled by a diet that was not only monotonous but significantly inferior in nutritional value, often leading to chronic malnutrition. The cornerstone of their survival was bread, but not the soft, refined loaves of the elite. Poor students relied on coarse, dark bread made from mixed flours of lower quality, which was often hard and stale. To wash it down that rider. This wasn't a sign of indulgence. In an era where urban water sources were frequently contaminated, fermented beverages were a vital, safer source of hydration and calories. The main warm meal was usually a portage, a thick, watery soup made of boiled legumes, grains, and whatever local herbs could be scavenged. Meat was a ghost in their diet, appearing only during major religious festivals or on the rare occasion of a charitable donation. Salt was a precious luxury used sparingly to preserve what little they had, and fresh fruits or vegetables were strictly seasonal treats. When their meagre resources ran dry, the poor student had to turn to the only social safety net available, academic begging. In the Middle Ages, poverty was not always seen as a mark of shame, and the church held a fundamental obligation toward charity. Poor scholars would often circulate among nearby monasteries, which were required to provide occasional meals to the destitute and pilgrims. During religious festivities, students would gather in front of churches to participate in public collections, singing or reciting prayers in exchange for coins or scraps of food. They would even join funeral processions or large-scale ceremonies where wealthy benefactors were expected to distribute alms to the poor. Some desperate students wrote heartbreaking letters to potential patrons, framing their hunger as a sacrifice for the holy pursuit of wisdom. This mendicancy wasn't considered professional begging. It was a recognized, albeit grueling, strategy to stay alive long enough to finish a degree. For these young men, every crust of bread was a victory, and every bowl of soup was another day closer to a life beyond the reach of starvation. For the poor student, the classroom was only half of their daily struggle. The other half was spent in the gig economy of the Middle Ages. To bridge the gap between starvation and a degree, many turned their only assets, literacy and steady hands, into a source of income. The most common side hustle was working as a scribe or copyist. In a world before the printing press, the demand for written text was insatiable. Poor students would spend their nights hunched over parchment, copying lecture notes, legal documents, or religious tracts for wealthy masters and local booksellers. It was grueling, eye-straining work that paid very little, often just enough for a few loaves of bread or a night's stay in a shared cellar. Those who were further along in their studies often became tutors to the younger, wealthier students. A poor but brilliant scholar might be hired to drill a nobleman's son in Latin grammar or logic. Others found work within the university administration itself, serving as assistants to masters, cleaning lecture halls, or even working as correctors to proofread manuscripts for errors. While these jobs provided a meagre lifeline, the income was rarely stable and barely covered the costs of basic subsistence. However, by the 13th century, a radical alternative emerged. The Mendicant Orders, specifically the Franciscans and the Dominicans. These orders turned the social hierarchy on its head by practicing voluntary poverty. Unlike traditional Benedictine monasteries, which often required a financial dowry or donation for admission, the mendicants accepted vocations from any social background. For a talented poor student, joining these orders was a masterstroke of survival. The Dominicans, in particular, became pioneers in university education. By becoming a friar, a poor student gained access to a massive support network, a roof over their head, a communal table, and a path to the highest levels of theological study without the crushing burden of tuition fees. The orders provided a sense of community and legitimacy. Being poor was no longer a mark of shame but a spiritual virtue. This was the path taken by some of the greatest minds of the era, such as Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure, proving that when the financial barriers were removed, the sons of the poor could outshine the sons of kings. The medieval university was not a peaceful sanctuary of shared wisdom. It was a volatile social battlefield where wealth and poverty clashed daily in the streets. For a poor student, his very appearance was a target, while the sons of nobles strutted in fur-lined robes and silk-trimmed hoods. The poor scholar was easily identified by his shabby aesthetic. He was simpler, often thin wool or linen that had been patched a dozen times. In some extreme cases of shared poverty, roommates would even alternate using a single decent cloak or pair of shoes, meaning one student had to remain huddled in a dark cellar while the other attended a lecture in the only respectable outfit they owned. This visibility led to systemic humiliation. Wealthy students often subjected their poorer peers to penal hazing rituals and verbal mockery, treating them more like servants than fellow scholars. This social exclusion was reinforced by the university structures themselves. Many student societies, known as nations or colleges, which provided vital protection and networking, would flatly refuse admission to those who couldn't pay the entry fees or maintain a certain lifestyle. When words turned to blows, the violence was often organised along regional and class lines. In Oxford, for instance, documented riots broke out between the Northerners and Southerners, groups that often split along economic divides. Records show nearly 2 centuries of bloody skirmishes between wealthy English students and the often much poorer Welsh scholars. These weren't just schoolyard scuffles. They were full-scale street brawls involving daggers, bows, and clubs. Beyond the physical danger, there was a profound psychological toll. Imagine the chronic stress of knowing that a single lost coin or a ruined pair of shoes could end your academic career forever. There was a constant academic anxiety, a desperate pressure to make every sacrifice count, knowing that your family back in the village had likely given up their own meagre comforts to send you there. For many, the university was a lonely, hostile place where they were treated as outsiders in a world they were desperately trying to join. It was a test of character as much as a test of intellect. Only the most resilient could survive the combined weight of poverty, mockery, and the constant threat of violence. After years of hunger, cold, and social humiliation, the poor student reached his final crossroads. For those who managed to survive the grueling curriculum and the even more grueling lifestyle, the reward was a degree, a piece of parchment that functioned as a rare key to a different world. But was the gamble worth it? For a significant minority, the answer was a resounding yes. Education was one of the very few elevators in the rigid medieval social structure. A talented student from a peasant background could rise to become a master, a royal advisor, or a high-ranking official in the growing state bureaucracies. Literacy and a command of Latin opened doors to careers as notaries, scribes, or legal experts, positions that offered a level of security and influence their parents could never have imagined. The most prestigious path, however, remained within the church. The brightest minds often ascended to become bishops or even papal legates. We see this in the lives of legendary figures like Thomas Aquinas. Although he came from a minor noble family that had fallen on hard times, his journey through the university system and the Dominican order allowed him to become a doctor of the church, a title that commanded more respect than many kings. These success stories served as powerful beacons of hope for the thousands of young men still shivering in shared attics, proving that merit could, on occasion, overcome bloodlines. Yet, we must be honest about the statistics. These trajectories of success were the exception, not the rule. A vast majority of poor students never finished their degrees. Many were forced to drop out due to debt, while others succumbed to the chronic health issues caused by their years of deprivation. By the late 15th century, as the economic landscape shifted and universities became increasingly elitist and aristocratic, the window of opportunity for the poor began to narrow even further. Ultimately, the story of the poor medieval student is a story of extraordinary resilience. They were the pioneers of the modern academic spirit, individuals who believed so deeply in the transformative power of knowledge that they were willing to risk their health, their safety, and their very lives to obtain it. Their legacy isn't just found in the stone walls of Oxford or the Sorbonne, but in the very idea that education should be a right based on talent, not a privilege based on gold. The next time you walk through a university campus or open a textbook, remember the scholars of the shadows, the ones who sang for their bread, slept on straw, and fought through the cold to ensure that the light of learning was never extinguished.